This podcast is recorded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people.
British Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is February 27th, 2020, and this is episode 178.
I'm Scott de Lundeboom.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. On today's show, is it a lack of reconciliation or a lack of commitment to climate change that's killing Canada's economy? First, we have to thank those who help make the show possible. 88 people give us money every month at patreon.com/politicos. Thank you all. No new patrons this week. And I think someone actually lowered their money a little, which hurts my feelings. So I think that's a hate crime. Politicos is in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicos enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to politicstoday.news/free-trial. Let's round up what's been happening in the BC legislature. They're tabling bills left, right, and center.
Well, mostly left and center.
Some of these are... No, they're not right, but they're just kind of things that need changed and need updated.
You're over-explaining the joke a bit there.
Yeah, I tried too much. First up, the province is modernizing the arbitration rules. They say this is to improve access to justice. This is a really dry bill. I didn't look too deeply into it, but...
I think, honestly, we're going to have to get someone who knows the legal arbitration system on to walk through it to talk about it in real detail.
If there's something controversial about it. As far as I can tell, David Eby describes it as the current legislation reflects practices dating back to the 19th century and haven't been significantly changed since the 1980s. So the new act reflects the best practices for fair, efficient, and final resolution of options for British Columbians. In other words, we have a really outdated scheme. It looks like they want to bring it in line with international norms so that if you need to arbitrate a dispute, like say we blow up the podcast and we need to go to arbitration, it'd be nice to have a fair, modern system and not something developed in the 19th century to deal with that. Like dueling, I guess. It's probably not dueling.
Probably not. Disputes in BC would be a lot more interesting, to say the least, if it was. But speaking of disputes, the BC government's taking another cake at the can about capping expert testimonies in ICBC settlement cases. They're once again going to try and change the Evidence Act to cap the number of expert witnesses, but a softer cap this time, where you don't actually have to petition the court to allow more, as well as put limits on how much of the settlements can be paid out to expert witnesses.
Yeah, this is kind of a precursor to the big ICBC overhaul that's coming, the no-fault insurance stuff. This is still controversial. The trial lawyers don't like it. But
Shocker.
The goal is, to create a fast-track option. If you have a total claims of under $100,000, then let's just all agree you just get one expert and one expert report. Others, larger claims, you could have up to 3 experts. But of course, if both parties just agree with a handshake, you can bring in as many experts as you want. But in general, let's try to have fewer because they're expensive. This comes as, I believe it was Global News had another story this week of someone who's alleging that lawyers took like 90% of the settlement and almost took it all, but took a bit of pity at the end and let this person have a few $1,000s from their 6-7 figure settlement.
So this legislation doesn't actually cap the lawyers' payouts, but it would put a 5% of the settlement cap on it, or I think it was $3,000 per report.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of different things that need to be tweaked around. I think they're going to keep trying because if they don't, ICBC is just going to implode and then we won't have car insurance and that will be bad.
Are you the one who's saying ban cars?
I mean, as long as there are vehicles on the road that are going to hit me, someone needs to pay for my, pain and suffering. But another area where people are suffering is nonprofits, small businesses, and cultural organizations in high tax regions of various municipalities. One of my friends on Facebook actually ran a co-working space in the downtown east side called The Place, which was formerly Creative Coworkers, and they actually just went bankrupt in the last couple months because it's really hard And I think when they signed the lease, they didn't realize the property taxes would jump as much as they did and got hit directly with that. And so the province has been looking at this, and a number of different levels have been looking at, how do we make it so the property taxes, which are often on the highest and best use, are still affordable for those organizations that we probably want around, but aren't the highest and quote unquote best use.
Yeah, so the highest best use is there to incentivize, property owners to actually make good use of their property. You don't want like a old, one floor building, right in the center of downtown when there's so much demand and so much people who would benefit from having a, 40-story office building with maybe some residential in there. But the problem is if you only have that one storefront, that can be a lot of taxes if you're taxed as though you're a 40-story building. And what makes this particularly challenging is the incentives aren't well aligned because most commercial leases are what are known as a triple net, where the person renting the space is paying the property taxes and they can't just go and knock down the building and put up a 40-story building in its place.
Yeah.
So a lot of municipalities and business owners have been pushing for split assessments, basically saying, okay, you tax the existing commercial at one use and then you have a separate assessment for the other stuff with a different tax rate applied to it. That's not what they've done here. They've just tweaked the Municipalities Act and the Vancouver Charter, will tweak them to allow those cities to create special tax rates for select businesses that are described in the legislation.
Yeah, and the province is calling this an interim measure. Minister Selena Robinson is still working on what she hopes is a longer, more effective solution, because there's also a lot of concerns about the split tax rate because muddies the tax code and also removes those incentives you talked about, which can be very useful.
Although at least in the case of Vancouver, you don't need that much of an incentive to redevelop.
Maybe the hope will be we'll eventually ban triple net leases and put the tax burden on the property owner and then have some kind of limit on property tax increases per year on commercial rents, sort of a fix for that, as a way to buffer that, at least for the nonprofits and arts communities who are struggling. It's a really tough area because rents are expensive and a lot of these organizations don't have a ton of money that don't want to just give it over to property taxes.
Yeah, so the city's already said City of Vancouver has already said they're not too happy with it. The provincial Liberals, who have their own private member split assessment bill that they introduced last term and then are reintroducing now, aren't happy with it. And I mean, part of the reason the city isn't happy with it is because they have to do the messy work of it and they don't have the greatest tax policy already. So part of the reason it's actually a problem here in the city of Vancouver is we basically use our business taxes to subsidize the residential taxes. And Vancouver has one of the widest ranges between the residential and commercial tax rates.
So lots to pick apart at this. It looks more like the first attempt than the last, but hopefully it is, because if it ends up being one of those situations where the government goes, well, we'll just kind of move on from net here and forget about this, it kind of screws over everyone.
Yeah, this really does seem like an interim measure, but at the same time, I don't think it's really pleasing very many people. We already talked about how the city's not happy with it, but I haven't heard, great sighs of relief from, the business community here about this either, which means it's probably a bit of a dud, at least politically.
Well, the next bill I think will be a little bit more popular, at least from my point of view, is a change to the School Act to allow school boards to offer childcare directly.
I didn't realize this wasn't a thing.
So right now, a school district like the Vancouver School Board or Burnaby School District or whatever can create a licensed agency, essentially, arm's length body or something like that, as far as I understand it, to run childcare before and after school, especially for elementary kids.
Yeah, the elementary school I went to in the Saanich School District, had a program. So I naturally just assumed, because as a 6-year-old, I wasn't privy to all those details, that this was just something the school board did directly. Now
I think they're just bringing it into the school board's power. They will have to pass a couple extra policies to be clear about how they're going to run it within the workings of Childcare BC, but can be a great step to help expand childcare options, which, as I start looking at, we need more because they're very expensive when they're not subsidized heavily.
And then the final bill to mention is the Miscellaneous Statutes Amendment Act to basic.
2020.
Yes, because we do this every year apparently.
There are a lot of typos in the register.
Yeah, so this is basically just going through and cleaning up a bunch of random laws, including the one you pulled out of here for the Guide and Service Dog Act.
Yeah, so this one actually does a little bit more than just clean up the commas and typos and fix date formats. It has a couple almost substantive amendments, it looks like. It's really interesting, I think, to see the Attorney General put out a press release on introduction of miscellaneous bill, which is just the most vague headline I've ever seen. But like you said, there's a change to the Guide Dog and Service Dog Act, which I did not know was a law here in BC. But this is the bill
How else do you think they registered the service dogs under?
I didn't think that much because of privilege, Scott. It, like you said, yeah, it lets the province have a standardized system for accrediting service dogs. Now, the system we have right now, I gather, is messed up because we are requiring almost a dual certification of service dogs, and this will streamline it so people training these dogs don't need to be double certified, which is good, in my opinion. It seems like it's a very simple change that, they keep emphasizing it will not take away existing protections for people with disabilities under the Human Rights Code. Let's simplify the act of getting guide and service dogs out there because those dogs are awesome. They're very good boys. There's also some substantive amendments to the Family Law Act. I think just bringing it a bit more in line with or making it a bit easier under the Freedom of Information Act for people going to family justice court to exchange personal information that would otherwise need to go through very bureaucratic systems. So there are little changes like that. There's changes that look at the Canadian Free Trade Agreement that we talked about a couple of years ago. There's, minor cross-referencing errors.
They're apparently appointing 5 new Supreme Court justices, BC Supreme Court
They're giving them the ability
yes,
to appoint more justices.
which they will use. Otherwise, they wouldn't go to the trouble of changing legislation.
So yeah, lots of little things. Usually isn't a controversial bill. Well, that was it for the new bills introduced this week. The other big BC Poly news this week, at least locally, was the launching of the money laundering inquiry, the Cullen Commission. It had its first hearings this week, and I didn't look as much at what was actually discussed at the commission itself, but David Eby sure had a lot to say and got a lot of press for his comments there at the opening because he almost spun it as his chance to further attack the BC Liberals.
You could probably take almost out of that sentence.
Yeah.
In fact, this has been a pretty consistent thing on his part, is using the money laundering issue, which does deserve scrutiny, as a giant partisan cudgel.
Yeah, he attacked the Liberals, calling for them to hand over cabinet documents to the commission, which the Liberals correctly pointed out. It's up to the commission to ask for them first, but they're at this point ready to comply, it sounds like.
Yeah, so they'll be doing their own review to, make sure they only release what's needed. And especially, some people have taken this as a nefarious thing, but cabinet confidence exists for a reason. And you don't necessarily want everybody second-guessing the frank discussions that go on in cabinet, and because you need to be able to make good decisions without the fear that the deliberations will be made public and there'll be blowback on it.
There's also a skepticism, I think, from a lot of people that the people who are deciding that what is and isn't to be seen are the ones most directly implicated, possibly, by it.
Yeah, but there is a very legitimate reason to...
I wasn't disagreeing. I was just saying there could be a third party possibly appointed to review it, like an ex-judge or something.
Yeah, but...
or a commission. But...
Yeah, I just do want to really make that point. Because, to use a topical example, if this current cabinet was deciding stuff on how to respond to the coronavirus, you want them to be able to honestly have those discussions and try and figure it out without necessarily thinking about what's going to be the most politically advantageous if those got released.
The other thing Eby wants the commission to do is to interview Christy Clark, Mike DeYoung, and Rich Coleman. And he says, they should be glad I'm not the commissioner because he's not. And it's a little weird that he keeps emphasizing who he wants to see dragged before this thing.
Yeah, there is something a little...
interference-y.
Unseemly about David Eby's glee and willingness to use this as a partisan wedge.
But it's an independent commission now, so I think he's gotten his excitement out at its launch, and we can hopefully see it operate more independently and move along.
The other news is there's update on the overdose crisis. The rate is dropping, but still at around 1,000 people dying from it.
Yeah, the BC Coroner Service does note that there's been a 36% decrease in overdose deaths since 2018 for 2019, which is a nice drop, but it's still 981 people who died last year. That's almost 3 a day, 2.7 per day. And that number will likely increase once they've attributed more deaths, as coroner services do. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time. We are basically back to the level where we were at in 2016. So the trajectory is right, but there's still a long way to go to make sure people aren't still dying. Kind of a good news, bad news story.
Mm-hmm.
And to round off our BC Poly Roundup, you pointed this one out, that Langford is in the amidst of a renaissance locally as they try to rebrand, and one part of that seems to be that they're bringing the BC Maritime Museum, not the Vancouver Maritime Museum that many listeners might be familiar with on Kitts Beach, but the one based in Victoria.
Yeah, so the current one's located on Humboldt Street, basically a block in from the Inner Harbor, which, if anything, might be a bit far for a maritime museum because, well, it's right in the name. It's a maritime museum, so one would naturally want to locate it by the ocean. That is not the plan right now, and in a slightly ridiculous thing, it's going to be located in an inland community, specifically Langford.
Like for me personally, museums are best centralized. Like when you have a museum district, like a tourist trap area.
So you mean like a block and a half from the Royal BC Museum?
Yeah. You could have a few museums spread around, but not like the suburb. It would be like trying to put a major museum in Burnaby or New West even. New West, I guess, has a better claim to it. But
or Surrey.
Yeah.
Langford's really the Surrey of Victoria.
Yeah. If you wanted to move, say, Vancouver's Maritime Museum to Surrey.
Although Surrey at least has like a navigable waterway going to it. There's a port in Surrey.
Yeah. My partner grew up in Langford, and I guess the nickname for it was Langhole, and it was never a nice place. It was kind of just, a bedroom suburb community. It has grown a lot. She doesn't recognize any pictures of it now, especially their video, which included quite a few shots of the ocean. So I think the only other thing to say is that Langford's new slogan is like, get shit done or something.
Oddly modern.
Yeah. Anyway, I guess Langford's the new place to go.
They'll get shit done with like a hashtag rather than an I.
Oh yeah, they can't say an actual swear. That'd be too risque.
Well, moving on to our main segment, reconciling resource development and climate change, does not exist here today.
Lots going on in the resource climate change reconciliation file this week. I figured we could just lump all these stories together and kind of flow our discussion through them, starting with the carbon tax and the Alberta Appeal Court giving Jason Kenney a big win.
Yeah, so this is a 4-1 decision out of Alberta, basically saying that this is an unconstitutional intrusion on provincial jurisdiction. Now, this kind of goes the opposite way of the other carbon tax cases, which has found it's permissible, which to my non-lawyer mind makes sense because the federal government has very broad taxation powers. But nevertheless, the Alberta Appeals Court didn't agree with that. And in a rather aggressively worded opinion in places, sided with
the act is a constitutional Trojan horse.
Which for judges is very pointed.
Almost every aspect of the province's development and management of their natural resources would be subject to federal regulation.
So I saw a lot of legal commentators raising quite a few eyebrows at the language in this one. And I can't necessarily disagree with that take. It does seem to be a perhaps more politically inflected court case than I've seen in a while.
Yeah, so this follows decisions from the Ontario and Saskatchewan appeal courts in favor of the federal government's position and supporting their right to impose the carbon tax. Now, each of those were not unanimous decisions, so there was a good chance it was going to the Supreme Court anyway. But now
I think there might have even been an automatic appeal, but don't quote me on that.
But now with the Alberta court going strongly against, it needs to be resolved at Canada's highest court, which I'm sure they're really looking forward to. And then we'll finally have some settlement over whether this a bit weirdly imposed carbon tax, which is imposed on provinces that don't otherwise have it, but that's kind of what they had to do because otherwise BC would have been mad being double taxed. We'll see. I'm still, if I had to put money down, I'd bet that the Supreme Court will side with the federal government on this.
I think that's fairly likely.
Even just by the number of judges who've sided with the federal government versus sided with against right now, it's still in their favor.
You don't actually have the same number of judges on each of the three panels, so it's a little hard to make
fair
that.
enough. So that was the big win for Alberta this week. The big loss for Alberta was that Teck Mining has decided not to pursue their Frontier Oil Sands project, the $20.6 billion project they've been planning.
So we talked about this 3 weeks ago now, and at that point, we were all kind of having to get up to speed on it because it had basically crept up on everybody, and I don't think anyone who isn't, with their ear to the ground in Alberta's oil industry really knew it was a big deal. But somehow, after they've decided to pull out, this has become a referendum on the whole future of Alberta, or at least that's how it's been spun.
Yeah, so if you listen to Jason Kenney, it's Trudeau's fault. These protests got out of hand. Everything is chaotic. You can't get anything built in this country. I'm more interested, in this case, listening to the president of the company on why he decided not to build his mine.
Yeah, and we should say right up front that, at the time we were talking about how it's an iffy project and wasn't sure it was going to go ahead because the economics alone weren't there. And, listening to the company, the economics aren't there. You basically need, I think, $90 a barrel of oil to make the project work. It's been a long time since it's been like that. It doesn't really look like that's going to be coming anytime soon.
Yeah, I think
even in the decade span, it's quite reasonably unlikely we'll ever hit 90 in that time frame.
I think it's floating around $50 or $60 right now, but don't quote me on that for sure.
It's kind of been in the 40 to 60 range for about 6 years now or something.
So Teck CEO and President Don Lindsay announced this, or at least released a letter slightly after the announcement was broken in the news. That's how I came across it, which contained the notable paragraph that, however, global capital markets are changing rapidly and investors and customers are increasingly looking for jurisdictions to have a framework in place that reconciles resource development and climate change in order to produce the cleanest possible products. This does not yet exist here today, and unfortunately, the growing debate around this issue has placed Frontier and our company squarely at the nexus of much broader issues that need to be resolved. So in other words, there's a big debate about climate change and the economy. They think their project can be squared within that circle. But given that Alberta, for example, reading between the lines, tore up its climate change plan and is fighting Canada's federally, and the federal government's climate change plan seems a bit iffy, launching another giant oil sands project doesn't seem like a great push to investors who might go, well, if the country changes a bit and gets real about climate change, will you still be supported?
Yeah. Also, it seems like it's getting just harder to get capital for these sorts of projects. There's BlackRock. One of the big investment firms in the U.S. did a big announcement a week or two ago now, basically saying that they were going to be adding a climate aspect to all of their decision-making on their investments. And it's just getting harder to find $20 billion to spend on a big oil investment.
It is also interesting to see the CEO of this company come out so directly and argue for the importance of a climate change plan.
So Teck is a mining firm. They do have a couple small oil sands projects, which they're a partial shareholder of, but that's not their main business. And the Frontier project was going to be a big kind of expansion into that market. So I can kind of see why they're perhaps more outspoken about it than, say, Suncor. Although even Suncor, I think, made positive noise about carbon pricing.
So yeah, this is an interesting move. The economics undoubtedly played a big role in this. Teck's been having some financial difficulties recently. I guess they've had poor financial results by coal prices that hit some of their projects. They had to write down one of their oil sands mines, and the rail blockades are affecting their bottom line more recently as well. So launching a massive project is probably not the easiest sell for their investors. And so the letter may also be a bit of a cover for our economics aren't good, but we're going to use this as a chance to advance some of the politics we'd like to see. Because like you say, they do a lot of mining, a lot of which touches on materials needed for solar panels. And I believe they just took over the solar panel farm in Kimberley, BC. That's on one of their old mining sites.
Yeah, I believe they did. There's MAID Oil, and oil sands company just made a purchase of that. I think it might be Teck, but I could be wrong on that.
So Teck made this move, and that, I guess, took all the weight off Trudeau's shoulders from having to make the big decision about whether to approve or deny it, because that was already starting to split his caucus.
Yeah, so Trudeau to rest easy, or at least from internal fractures on this one. Hasn't stopped the Conservatives, including the premiers of Alberta and Saskatchewan, from taking aim at Trudeau over this.
There's nothing he could really have done to make it easier for them. I mean, he could have just very quickly greenlit it, but that wouldn't have fixed the economics. So he was damned if he did, damned if he didn't. Like he always finds himself stuck in the middle. So I mentioned the rail blockades are affecting Teck's bottom line, and it seems like this past week has been one where public opinion and the effect of the protests across Canada in support of the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs are starting to tensify. That's not really a word, but, public opinion, we've seen one poll at least suggesting, is starting to churn. That's Ipsos Reid.
I think Angus Reid also put out another one today.
Yeah, 2/3 of people don't like being inconvenienced. Polls on protests, I don't find a lot of value in, because protesters aren't out there to get liked in a situation like this. They're out there to disrupt things until other things change.
Well, part of it is to influence public opinion. Like that is a part of protests, and if you see public opinion moving in a different direction, it's worth taking a note of at the very least.
I mean, at the same time, it's also kind of working, as there are more and more meetings planned. There was some shifts this past week as the RCMP started to come to some initial agreements with the chiefs, and it's all up in the air because the news changes by day. And where it was at walking into the studio, as far as I could tell, was there were planned meetings today, Thursday, and tomorrow, Friday, between the province, the federal government, and the chiefs to try to come to a resolution, both on pulling the RCMP out, hopefully standing down some of the protests across the country, and finding a way forward for consultations. Some of that is potentially facilitated by news that kind of leaked out of the Environmental Assessment Office. Not so much leaked out as didn't get noticed right away. And then I think it got picked up by, I want to say, the Narwhal. The Environmental Assessment Office has been issuing permits for the pipeline as it goes through. And for some of the pipeline around Morris River, where this Unistoten Healing Center is, there were conditions attached. Coastal GasLink submitted some reports over the subsequent years to try to address those conditions, and they tried to get comment from Darkhouse, who represent the Unistoten area, to respond, only they refused. So instead, the company relied on statements in the media and generally out there in the public, like I guess on social media, to try to say, here's how we've addressed it, which the Environment Assessment Office said wasn't good enough in December 2019, which wasn't a rejection of the report, but it wasn't an approval. It was
so they've asked
more.
So they've basically given them 30 days to go out and collect more information. Now it's not really clear from the reporting if they're going to be successful at that.
Yeah.
Because it's also a little hard to fault the company for, you had a slightly skeptical tone in your voice there, but it's hard to fault the company when they're going out trying to make these discussions happening and aren't having the option to do so, to then have to go to the next best thing.
Yeah, I don't know what the solution for them was. I believe what I've seen reported from the chiefs at different times is they want to deal with the province directly. And so in that vein, Darkhouse has made its concerns known directly to the Environmental Assessment Office, which is part of what led to the rejection of this report, which is just further frustrating the company, I can imagine, right?
Yeah.
But
It's like at a public policy side, like, do you necessarily want the province to be the one carrying the water for these projects, going out and doing the consultations themselves?
it makes,
Like, it's,
yeah.
the province is there to regulate there. It's not necessarily its job to do the work of the firms.
I guess the other way to look at it potentially from Darkhouse and the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chief perspective would be that they still view it as their unceded territory. So they need to negotiate on a nation-to-nation basis with the province of BC before they even start to talk about commercial projects on their territory. This does go to show how complicated and difficult this is. I don't know what's going to come out of this EAO follow-up consultation, but I think more hopeful about the discussions happening today and tomorrow with the provincial and federal governments.
Yeah, I could see very likely the Coastal GasLink comes back in 30 days saying, well, we tried. We weren't able to get a meeting. Can you please approve our original report?
I guess they'll just have to show what they actually did. If it was, we sent a couple emails, that probably won't be sufficient, but send someone to the camp, to the exclusion zone, and knock on some doors, try to be friends. It's tough. One of the things that I also want to just highlight in this is the Narwhal also has a Q&A with Adam Olsen on his perspective from being locked out of the legislature by people who are like yelling at him, stand with us. And he's like, I'm trying to, but I want to do it from in there. He did eventually get into the legislature and spoke in favor, but it's a good interview and gives an insight, because I always wondered what he was thinking as he had to walk by people yelling at him when he was pretty much on their side. And do we want to talk about the foreign-funded protester's turn?
So throughout the week in question period, the BC Liberals have been attacking the government in a lot of different ways over their response to the protests and everything. And I think it was yesterday, they used their time to talk about the foreign funding of the protests, which is this dumb meme that's out there in like conservative circles that the only reason anyone ever protests these things is that, or maybe not the only reason, but like a major motivation is foreign funding that helps support these. And like, there's no real evidence of it. And like, I can't for the life of me figure out why parties seem to be incapable of just not talking about this idea that doesn't have any support, but seems to be like really popular with their base, but makes them look crazy to everyone else.
So the quote-unquote evidence comes largely from Vivian Krause, who's done this as an independent researcher, and I won't fully knock her for that because a lot of the work I do is effectively independent research, but it's mainly focused on looking at charitable tax returns of several major organizations like Dogwood or the David Suzuki Foundation, those types of groups. And if she can't find those, looking at major U.S. foundation returns and seeing where their money goes, like the Tides Foundation, and can point to a couple grants given at a couple different times from those organizations in the U.S., those foundations, to Canadian nonprofits, for example, to oppose the oil sands, because U.S. environmentalists don't like them any more than Canadian environmentalists do. Now, when you look at those grants as a fraction of the total operating costs of most of these nonprofits, it's minuscule, especially divided over the several years they tend to be working on these projects.
Yeah, it's not, and it's also not like money doesn't go the other way across the border too. Like,
not as much though, because we're smaller,
relative sizes. But like, it's not like Canadians don't contribute to like international nonprofits that are U.S. based in this area.
And so the other element that comes up here is nothing's really been shown that there's been funding against this specific pipeline. Nevertheless, that hasn't stopped a number of media stories from coming out by going, oh, this protester is actually a U.S. citizen, or this person just moved here a few months ago, as though that diminishes their rights to speak out on an issue. I mean, the other part of it, and it applies a little bit less in this situation, is if we're going to complain about foreign money trying to influence things, then let's also talk about foreign-owned corporations. Now, Coastal GasLink's owned by TC Energy, which is a Calgary-based firm that's largely held. I did look this up today.
It's listed on the TSX.
It's listed on the TSX, but it's largely held, as far as I can tell, by the largest shareholders are like Royal Bank and major banks in Canada. They're not.
Yeah, like if you own a
generally US
Canadian
hedge
index
funds.
fund, you probably own shares in this project, and like CPP, I think probably owns shares because they own shares of everything. Because when you have hundreds of billions of dollars, that's just what you do.
Now, LNG Canada at the end of the line, I think, is a major portion of it is Royal Dutch Shell, which is not as much Canadian.
No, in fact, it's right in their name.
Yeah. So you're a big, freedom of money movement kind of guy, and I'm not as opposed to it either. So, like, let the nonprofits get money, let the corporations get money, don't let the political parties get money. That's what we've basically done.
Seems fairly reasonable.
It gets a little bit trickier during an election campaign, but this isn't that.
But yeah, getting back to the politics of it, though, like the Liberal Party here, the Conservative Party federally, like they keep hammering this point, and like I can't figure out who they're actually trying to convince or why they think this is gonna be the thing that wins them any support. I mean, foreign interference is never like a popular thing, but like it's far from clear that Canadians think this is a major problem, and the parties would be much better off hammering the points home about the protesters disrupting Canadians, causing problems, causing, economic hardships, trouble getting everywhere, whatever you want to do. Like, they'd be better off hitting those points about why it's causing problems for Canadians, and then trying to sell the benefits of the project for like the Canadian economy and stuff. Like, this is the strongest argument. I can't figure out why they're just not hammering that point home rather than going off on something that frankly sounds conspiratorial and undermines their credibility.
I do think it's good at riling up the base, which they need the money from, so they do need the donations. And I think the coherence of the argument is, or at least the rationale behind trying to push this argument is, they've seen how, or at least the BC Liberals in particular, saw how the NDP and other parties argued so much that we needed campaign finance reform in this province, and they refused it tooth and nail until like the last minute. And then now that it's been adopted, they went, all right, if we're going to change the law around political parties, let's also talk about those nonprofits who've not liked us for years. And they're trying to twist the rhetoric in much the same way that you'll see anti-choice and anti-LGBT groups try to use the language of human rights, I think. Like, you'll hear parents' rights or these religious rights come up in ways that don't really mesh with contemporary understandings of human rights. And so I don't think it's effective. I don't think it does tend to work, but I can kind of understand how they got there. But like you said, it's tinfoil hat stuff that gets silly, but also toxic. Because this week, the Liberals were also asking in question period about like the involvement of professors at University of Victoria in some of the protests. And that's getting into some like questioning academic freedom landscape, which is not a good place to go.
I kind of missed that one.
I think it was just this afternoon.
Okay.
But yeah, stay out of academia.
Like,
or don't go
I'm not even sure it's like
academics.
necessarily an academic freedom thing. Like, to me, it's much more just a case of like what people do on their own time shouldn't be a problem. I mean, if they're studying the protest, then it's maybe an academic freedom thing. If it's just someone on their own time who happens to be a professor, it just really seems to be a case of more, we shouldn't treat everything someone does on their personal time as a reflection of their employment.
Hard agree. Well, moving on to what I hope will be somewhat of a mini segment, but I could definitely rant about this for quite a while, is the latest updates in medical assistance in dying. Two major updates this week. Let's start with here in British Columbia. So the policy right now in BC is care homes and healthcare institutions that get at least 50% of their funding from the province and aren't faith-based have to provide assisted dying on facility if a patient requests it. That was brought in by the BC Liberals, and the NDP has been willing to uphold that. Recently, the Delta Hospice Society, which runs the Irene Thomas Hospice, has pushed back against this policy. Notably, over the last couple years, they've had a lot of internal battles as there were big membership drives, and eventually A bunch of board members who were staunchly opposed to assisted dying were voted in, and they said, all right, the patients at this largely publicly funded hospice will no longer have the right to an assisted death because we oppose that. And the province said, you will not get funding if you take that position. And they said, okay, we call your bluff. And this week, Adrian Dix said, all right, we're giving you a 365-day notice. After that, your money's gone, and we're going to figure out what to do with you because this hospice also sits on publicly owned land. So there's a good chance the province is just going to take this over entirely and put it in Fraser Health, which is actually a pretty tense situation because now the Liberals are actually calling out the NDP for enforcing the policy they brought in. They're saying this is an affront to the local community's desire, which is weird.
Yeah, it's kind of weird, especially because small organization boards are not necessarily reflective of the broader community. Like, I don't think everyone in Delta went out and voted on who's going to sit on the hospice board.
Yeah. Kind of like you could probably, I was going to say you could probably take over the park board in Vancouver with a concerted effort, but you do need a big party name attached to you.
Yeah, I mean, nobody pays attention to the park board, and for that reason alone, it's probably not worth electing them. But yeah, it also does mean you need a party.
Like, the big thing here is that this is a pretty aggressive move by the province to actually go through and cut the funding. We'll see where this goes and if this affects others. Like I said, the policy doesn't affect religious-based hospitals like St. Paul's and St. Joseph's that just actually became just a long-term care facility in Comox. But, I applaud Adrian Dix for standing up on this. That had to be a tough decision. The other big news federally is that Justice Minister David Lametti has introduced Bill C-7, which is the successor to Bill C-14, which is the new assisted dying laws, the changes that are motivated by the Supreme Court of Quebec's decision recently that restricting access to people whose natural death is reasonably foreseeable is unconstitutional. So this bill introduces a swath of new changes to try to meet that ruling and also tweak a number of different other areas, and overall is kind of like some good in terms of access and some like, I don't know where that came from. So one of my big issues with C-14 was that what does reasonably foreseeable natural death actually mean? And a lot of people said that's a very vague term that seemed to come out of nowhere. So it's good that that's gone, but C-7 actually doesn't totally get rid of it. It splits your qualifications on whether...
It's a two-track process.
Yes. It creates a two-track process for whether you get for how you get an assisted death. If your death is still reasonably foreseeable, whatever that means, it's actually a slightly simpler process. You only need one witness instead of two. They don't need to have as serious of qualifications. I think you can have... They still need to be independent, but I don't think you need to get like two independent doctors kind of thing. They've eliminated the 10-day waiting period for you, which is good because that was kind of arbitrary. There could still be a waiting period agreed with your doctors, and that's fine. And they've also introduced for people whose death is imminent, advance directive type situations. So if you know that you are going to die soon, but you're suffering, but you'll also probably lose the ability to consent, this provision would allow you to make an agreement with your doctor, signed, witnessed, all done properly, that on a certain day, at a certain time, the act will happen. Whereas previously, you need to be able to consent at the last moment. So we had situations where some people were hastening their death before they otherwise would have because they feared losing that capacity. So this is all nice. This is compassionate, and it's good. I like that change. On the other side, for people whose reasonable death is not naturally foreseeable, you have now different criteria, which include a 90-day waiting period from your initial assessment when a doctor certifies that, yes, you are suffering, you shouldn't have to, you are aware of all the options, you can choose your death. And then you have to be clear for 90 days and committed to that for 3 months effectively, which is a long time to be suffering.
I can kind of see why they put that in there, though, because on the case where it's not as immediately clear as the, although somewhat vaguely worded, immediate early foreseeable death, it's you do want people to be able to really contemplate, really make sure that this is what they want, and like any waiting period is going to ultimately be arbitrary. But I can see why the government doesn't want people to rush into it.
Yeah, Yeah, I'm not fundamentally opposed to a waiting period in that situation. It does feel on the excessive end to me. Maybe we could go down to 30. Maybe that's where the 10 goes. It's a place where I think reasonable people can disagree. I feel like 90 is at the high end. The other thing, it also requires that it puts in the criminal code that the patient must be made aware of other services, palliative care options, treatments, etc., which is something that's already in doctors' ethical codes. And it's one of those things when you put it in the criminal code, I feel like it's getting into that territory of some U.S. states where they're like trying to force information on women seeking an abortion. And like yes, it's good to have doctors tell people all their options, but with the threat of criminal sanction feels a bit much for me.
Yeah, like I can see why you'd want to put it in the law, but yeah, not every problem necessarily needs to go in the criminal code to be that way.
It's one of those ones where I think the medical system is solving itself largely. Like each province has, beyond the criminal code, has how MAID works, and that's been developed really well, actually. And it's rolling out with patchworks, but
yeah, but like maybe the Canada Health Act's the place to put it or something.
The Canada Health Act is actually surprisingly short. It's only like a page or two.
Yeah.
But it's a regulation thing.
But yeah, there's a spot where you can probably slot it that isn't necessarily the criminal code.
The last major area that I think is going to get challenged in C7 is that there's a full exclusion on mental health. So if you are suffering and it's a mental illness issue, then that has been explicitly excluded from the grounds that could be considered. Now, the Supreme Court of Canada was clear in Carter that if you are suffering from a grievous and irremediable condition, the government can't get in your way of letting you have an assisted death. It did not differentiate between physical and mental harm because there actually isn't a difference in reality. In the medical system, sometimes we just label things as mental health issues when we can't really tell what else they are. And I get it is challenging to treat mental health issues and they're worried.
Yeah, this was the area that's probably the toughest, and I would guess most Canadians would be uncomfortable with extending it to mental health issues.
And I think that's largely our difficulty of talking about mental health issues.
I'm not necessarily sure it is, though. Like it,
but I think it.
Like so, I think people or Canadians are largely at the point of accepting that people who like fully look at their situation, understand it, and consent to it. That's fine. The challenges with mental health issues is it can sometimes interfere with that process, or Canadians definitely perceive it to interfere with that process.
Well, and that's where the misunderstanding is because the assumption is if you have a mental health issue that you can never consent or that you are inconsistent with your consent. But the reality is actually quite a large spectrum. There can be people who have mental health issues but are never able to make a clear, informed consent. And then there are people who still suffer from mental health issues but are totally competent, but are just suffering in different ways. And starting to suss that out is something I think we need to do as a country just for
but I get why Canadians want to err on the side of caution when it comes to that.
Where I think this will get really interesting is, unlike with Bill C-14, the government doesn't have a majority now and can't do what they basically did last time, which was tweak the rules to push it through at the end after not working it very well. So they need to get someone on side with this. Now, I could see the Conservatives saying this opens things up too much, and I can see the NDP and actually the Bloc saying this goes too far in other realms. I don't actually know how they get this bill passed without going one way or the other. So that will be the interesting thing to watch. And if you feel strongly about medical assistance in dying, for or against, now is a really good time to write your members of parliament and the senators, because the Senate, I think, is going to take a very long, hard look at this. The accompanying charter statement has not been released with this bill. So charter statements are something new the Liberals brought in last year, which are the Justice Department is supposed to analyze how constitutional a bill is. It'll be really interesting to see what this looks like.
Within that specific part of the Constitution. Like, they're not looking at like Section 92.
The charter.
Yeah.
How much of the charter does it comply with? So lots coming on medical assistance in dying. Obviously, I'm hugely biased because I've spent a lot of this week working on this file for the BC Humanist Association. I'll put some neutral links in the show notes as well as my own links, and you can find what you want, dear listeners.
Well, let's move on to the leadership roundup. Today was the deadline for Conservative candidates for leader to get their first batch of signatures and deposit in at 5 p.m. Eastern today. The party hasn't released the final list yet. That might even be as much as a week from now. But we know that Peter MacKay and Aaron O'Toole have already got theirs in because they're sending out emails like crazy, even if people are lapsed members. So they've clearly got the lists and are sending those out. But we've also expect that Leslyn Lewis, a lawyer and unsuccessful candidate in the 2015 election, Marilyn Gladu, the MP for Sarnia Lamberton, Derek Sloan, another MP, first term from Hastings Lennox and Addington, and Jim Karahelios, who's the article describes him as an anti-carbon tax activist who's currently in a legal battle with the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party.
He's married to Ontario Progressive Conservative MPP Belinda Karahelios.
So those are the people that are expected to have the initial batch of signatures, I think $25,000 deposit.
It's unclear if Rick Peterson is in. I'm looking at a CTV article that suggests he is an approved candidate, but CBC earlier today was saying didn't include him on the list.
So he's a maybe.
Okay.
From what I can tell.
There
was a Globe article that came out shortly before I came here to record, and I don't think that really nailed down whether Rick Peterson managed to get in or not either.
Well, we'll find out next week-ish, hopefully, from the Conservatives, because they do have some vetting to do as well. And, making sure the signatures are real.
Yes, but our favorite drifter candidate, Aaron Seal, does not appear to be on this list at all. The Millennial Conservatives run has come to an end.
Well, he can go back to his yoga and cannabis business.
Yeah, pretty much it seemed like this whole thing was just to push out his cannabis business and try and gin up some notoriety for it. So I may have already talked about him too much.
So the good news is that this race looks to be at least half as big, if not smaller, than the previous leadership race, which I think was one of the hopes of the party by having a $300,000 and 30,000 signature or whatever it was entry requirement, which means the two debates, which are going to be happening in Toronto on April 17th in English and in Montreal on April 23rd in French, will be a little bit more manageable.
Noticeably absent from there is a Western Canada debate.
Or Maritimes, or North. Well, no, there's never a debate in the North. But yeah, Toronto and Montreal is an interesting choice. I imagine there will probably be some unofficial debates held across the rest of Canada that end up getting most of the candidates. But to be honest, the Conservatives don't really need to gin up support in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So focusing on Toronto and Montreal seems like the wise choice for the party.
Yeah, I do think the Conservative Party does need to throw at least a little meat to their Western base.
Considering people are voting out here.
Yeah, with that weighted ballots, less important, but we might get to this in a moment about the Buffalo Declaration thing, but there's definitely some angst in the West on this. And I did just pull up that Globe article by Marita Walsh. So it does list Rick Peterson as one of the 9 people likely to clear this first hurdle, along with former political staffer Rudy Husson, who I'm not particularly familiar. I think he might have got like a brief moment of notoriety when did some very socially conservative talking points on an interview or something, but probably not worth getting into too much. But we may be discussing next week when we'll hopefully have the list.
Well, the only other bit of leadership roundup we have to add, I couldn't find actually any news out of the federal Green leadership race or the BC Green leadership race, but I will announce that I'm going to be interviewing Sonia Furstenau, the, as far as we know, only declared candidate for the BC Green leadership tomorrow. We'll put that interview hopefully up on the feed for patrons this weekend, and it'll go in with our regular episode next week. So yeah, join us at patreon.com/politicos to get early access to that interview. Now let's jump into quick takes. The Senate is back in the news as Lynn Bayek first apologized, but then still got suspended for being racist.
So when the Parliament resumed, I think we mentioned this briefly, that they were reconsidering suspending her because when it rose last time, the previous suspension ended. And, well, now we know the results.
Yeah, the apology she made did sound like she attempted to be sincere. She said that she was apologetic for the hurtful comments included in the very racist letter she published on her website, and she was trying to do better. The Senate held a vote of its entire body, which did not need to be recorded because it was clear enough to the speaker by just a voice vote that most senators supported her being suspended again. So she's back on suspension, no access to her office, no money, no stipends, pending her finishing another sensitivity training class with a report back to the Senate Ethics Committee to say how much did she actually learn and do, because it didn't sound like the last one actually worked out that well.
No, it didn't. There really needs to be a better process to kind of get senators out.
Yeah, lifetime appointments aren't great, it seems. We just abolish the whole thing. Let's go that way.
I think Senate reform in pretty much any direction's dead. Because our Constitution's impossible to, practically speaking, it's impossible to amend. I'm just trying to think of a segue. I don't think there's a good segue from Lin Bayat to China, so we will just plow ahead regardless. To the next story, where the Globe and Mail's reporting that Global Affairs Canada issued a warning to the Trudeau government, including to the new Minister for Foreign Affairs, Philippe Champagne, about the fact that China is not necessarily the country we should be looking to deepen ties with, and that they represent a strategic challenge to both Canadian values and interests.
So this report came out because it was a standard briefing note that was prepared for the incoming Foreign Affairs Minister, something that is traditionally done after an election. The bureaucracy prepares briefing notes to say, here's where we're at, here's the things you should be aware of, and they're generally all just internal. This came to light as the Canada-China Committee, the committee that was formed by the opposition ganging up on the government on like day 1 or 2, I guess, managed to secure this document by requesting it and released it as part of their records. So already that committee is paying some dividends.
Yes. I think that's quite interesting because the China, like how to deal with China is obviously going to be something that's really going to be a challenge going forward, probably for the next several decades. And in the past, the Trudeau government's been fairly favorable towards China, especially when they came in 2015. And that hasn't necessarily gone particularly well. And in general, I think Canada needs to figure out which orbit it wants to be in, and it's really hard to see a case for that orbit being anything but Europe and the US. And hopefully the government pays attention to this, and I guess we'll get our next test when the Huawei decision about whether or not they get access to our 5G network is going to come down.
Yeah, China's a complicated file. Another complicated file is Alberta, and complicating it further are 4 Conservative MPs, Michelle Rempel Garner, Blake Richards, Glenn Motz, and Arnold Viersen, who've issued what they called the Buffalo Declaration, which is, I'm just going to quote the Globe and Mail, outlining a list of complaints dating back to before Alberta became a province in 1905, which includes the National Energy Program in the 1980s, the equalization system, carbon taxes, and this year's rail blockades. It's an airing of grievances, which is, I guess, an Alberta pastime. Among that list...
past Festivus season, isn't it?
Yeah. Michelle Rempel's the most prominent of those MPs. She's been fairly prominent in the media, has been a strong spokesperson for the party, sometimes a little bit controversial, but...
Definitely one of the more well-known
Yeah,
MPs.
one of the more standout ones. Blake Richards, I don't think as many know. I know him more directly as the MP for my parents in the constituency where I grew up. I think he took over from Myron Thompson, who was the cowboy hat wearing, long-term, stereotypical Southern Albertan.
You might need to be a little more specific with that description.
Glenn Motz I've never heard of, and Arnold Viersen was most recently in the news for, I believe, accusing new NDP MP Laurel Collins of being a sex worker.
Well, that was him. Okay. Charming.
Yeah. Or he didn't accuse her of being a sex worker. He asked if she had ever been during a debate.
Oh, no, I think, was it considering? Anyway, it's not important, the exact wording of it.
So a hodgepodge group of Albertan conservatives. I mean, I don't think there's anything particularly new in this list or this push, I actually almost missed it, except that like the Alberta politics half of my Twitter was erupting over mocking it for being silly. And I think it's notable that 4 Conservative MPs put their name to it, including Garner or Rempel Garner.
Now, it's not a lot of MPs from other parties to sign off on that. But the timing's not a coincidence. I'm not the first person to notice that. Like, it's probably a thing to try and influence the leadership race as much as anything.
And there's not really a leadership candidate from Alberta to champion those causes.
Which I think just part of the reason why. This is a very Eastern-focused leader. Actually, no, Rick Peterson, he moved to Edmonton.
That's true.
Between the last leadership and this one.
But like we said, we don't know if he's actually in the race. He's Schrodinger's candidate for now. I think this declaration got most noticed by people zeroing in on how it argues, I think, a separation referendum is inevitable for Alberta, which is just another like Wexit facepalming. Do we have to keep talking about this kind of stuff?
Well, speaking of Wexit, it is the worst name. I feel like I'm doing an Elmer Fudd impression every time I say it. It's terrible name. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But like, it's noticeable that the Wexit stuff didn't get much traction with elected politicians, and this one clearly has, which is interesting. Like, it clearly has a little more resonance than before. I'm not sold on the fact that a referendum's inevitable.
I'm actually surprised they only got 4 MPs to sign on to this. Like, the Conservatives have a large caucus in Alberta.
28 members? 28
and minus 1.
I think it's 29 seats. Yeah, so it's probably 20. Anyway, yeah, or couldn't even get a couple of MLAs to join in on this too. Do a split federal-provincial thing. It would be a little more impactful if it's, both levels of government.
Buffalo Declaration probably going to be forgotten, not even as powerful as the firewall letter, but we'll leave it at that. And finally, Conservatives were in the news this week as Andrew Scheer released a little video trying to defend free market capitalism amidst controversies over Paw Patrol.
So, back in like the first week of February, CBC ran a admittedly slightly
or something.
Pardon?
It was like an opinion piece or analysis column.
No, like they had some random professor on who had a bunch of silly opinions about Paw Patrol, and it was overall a silly piece. And then like 2.5 weeks later, which in internet time might as well have been 5 years, Andrew Scheer put out like a Facebook social media video defending Paw Patrol from the CBC.
Why is CBC acting like capitalism is a bad thing?
It was really weird. Like, it's fair to ask that, okay, we put in $1 billion a year to the CBC. It's silly stuff like this really the best we can get out of it for our collective investment in our national broadcaster? That wasn't really what he did, though. So, like,
he just tried to weigh into a cultural war, like, debate 3 weeks too late.
Yeah, it was weird. Honestly, the best part of this for me was just I spent like the week making asking if Paw Patrol was the reason the Teck Frontier mine got canceled on Twitter. Like, it was just fun to joke around about more than anything else.
As a new father, we'll at some point have to make decisions about the content my child consumes because that's the power I get as a parent. I don't know if Paw Patrol will be in there. I mean, I kind of viewed in some of the articles, and it is weird, but all children's entertainment is kind of weird.
Yeah, like,
so,
like, I mean, we're all talking about Paw Patrol, but like, Pokemon basically is a world where dogfighting is the national sport. And like, nobody talks about that at all. And I just grew up with it.
Yeah.
It's super weird. Like all kids' programs are. You just shouldn't dissect them too closely because you'll just come away confused. And that has been Politicos. Find links to everything we talked about at politicos.ca. Support the show and get access to our exclusive Slack channel at patreon.com/Politicos. Our intro music credit is Beautiful British Columbia by Saoirse Plotnikoff. Politicos is a production of Leg and Boot Media, and editing services are provided by Cortado Productions. Thanks for listening.